Welcome back, everybody. Biden's America Last agenda continues through his Secretary of State, Antony Blinken. Blinken says he's invited the United Nations to investigate systemic racism in the U.S. There is no credible evidence of this or any major human rights abuses in the United States. However, in China, the CCP has 3 million Uyghurs in slave camps. In Russia, Cuba, and Venezuela, political dissidents are being silenced, beaten, or killed. But Blinken isn't calling for human rights investigations into those countries. Joining me now to weigh in is America First Policy Institute ambassador and former co-chair of Women for Trump, Madison Gesiotto-Gilbert. Madison, welcome back to the Salcedo Show. Blinken saying, well, responsible nations must not shrink from scrutiny of their human rights record. Rather, they should be transparent with the intent to grow and do better. What's your take on Team Biden serving American citizens up to despots, dictators, and anti-Semites at the UN?
You know, Chris, I had to read that quote about 3 times before I actually believed that came out of his mouth. I'll take Secretary Pompeo back any day now. This is an embarrassment to the United States. Secretary Blinken is awful. The Biden administration is awful. They're an embarrassment to the United States, and what they're doing is dangerous. Requesting that the United Nations investigate the freest and greatest country in the world for systemic racism that does not exist. As you mentioned, there's no credible evidence of this happening because it isn't happening. And I think what's so comical about this is even if something like this were happening, who in their right mind would call the United Nations, whose Human Rights Council includes countries like China, Venezuela, Russia, Pakistan, Eritrea, Somalia? I mean, is this a joke? Cuba? These are the people who investigate human rights violations, the worst human rights abusers from across the world. It's appalling, to be quite honest with you.
It is a joke. It is. The Biden administration is the biggest joke that's not funny. Biden administration is also responsible for creating multiple crises in the United States and abroad. You got all the illegal aliens coming across our border, creating a national security, humanitarian, and public health crisis. Add to that, Democrat-sponsored crime waves all over the United States. Our infrastructure is continually being attacked by Russia. And now reports say that because of Biden's irresponsible pullout of Afghanistan, he's created a humanitarian crisis there. This is what socialist Democrat incompetence looks like, no?
Absolutely. And by putting America last, we're seeing how weak the Biden administration really is. They're not strong across the world. They're not respected. And so when you look at organizations like the Taliban and terrorist organizations all across the world, they don't fear Biden. They don't fear that we will do anything to them if they don't honor agreements made. Whereas under the Trump administration, I think there was a sincere fear among leaders like Kim Jong-un or among the Taliban and others that maybe Trump is just crazy enough to do something to them what that other leaders, Republican or Democrat in the United States, would not have done. And so I think they were more hesitant to violate agreements. And we saw that with things being accomplished within the Trump administration when it came to foreign policy that many said would never be accomplished. They said it would be impossible to see any type of steps towards peace in the Middle East. And that's exactly what we saw in that region. But now, of course, we're taking steps backward in many countries, Afghanistan being one of them. And it's sad, especially because we did fight somewhat of an endless war for almost 20 years in Afghanistan, over 2,300 lives lost, U.S. military lives on Afghanistan soil, many more injured, my cousin being one of them. So this is a very personal issue to me, and it's sad to see the suffering of the Afghan people as well.
And it's only going to get worse. Meanwhile, speaking of people who are suffering, the Cuban people seeking to get rid of their Democrats, the communist regime of Cuba, Black Lives Matter is calling on the U.S. to end the embargo to Cuba and stand with the communist regime. That's pretty much BLM speed, right? I mean, supporting violence and seeking to oppress people through that violence. Here's a soundbite from one of their multiple riots over the last year and a half. Listen.
We need a revolution in order to overthrow this system, bring a whole new communist world into being that can actually ensure the rights of black and brown people. And whether or not you agree, or if you still are caught up in this electoral politics bullshit, even if you are, even your hopes for a more progressive or liberal agenda are not going to happen while the second president of the Confederacy is in the White House. Let's work together to tear that statue down.
Revolution, nothing less.
Yeah, revolution, nothing less. Shouldn't real Americans, Madison, treat BLM like the Marxist traitors they really are?
Yeah, and they continue to expose themselves over and over again. And I think many more Americans are starting to see the truth about them, that they want to destroy America and push Marxism. But the unfortunate part is that many of our congresspeople continue to push them as heroes, or that they're really a great organization that cares about Black lives. They don't care about Black lives. They didn't care about Black lives here in the United States, and they don't care about Black lives right now in Cuba as they step forward and support the communist regime essentially with their comments. And so it's very frustrating to see the hypocrisy of all of this, yet the mass amount of funding that went to this organization, it's pretty disturbing.
Yeah, and all of those American companies that funded this anti-American Marxism, they ought to be ashamed of themselves. Madison Gesiotto-Gilbert, always a pleasure talking with you.
Hey, I'm Rob Finnerty. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this video, please join the conversation in the comments below. Don't forget to subscribe, too. Hit the bell icon to be alerted to breaking news. And remember, there's a whole lot more on Newsmax TV, America's fastest growing cable news network. Newsmax TV, we're real news for real people.